Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of the Future Tech podcast series. It's me, Charlie Sell, the board director of Major Group, where I get a chance to speak, interview thought leaders, investors, senior technology professionals, all within the technology space, asking them a bit about their story. We'll be talking about subjects that are really relevant and close to their hearts, and we always finish on that all-important career advice for many of our young listeners. So I'm really pleased to have Toby Lywood with me today. Toby is an investor for Ox Capital, and Ox Capital is a venture capitalist business that specializes in B2B SaaS-based companies. So a nice thing about these type of podcasts is Toby has a breadth of experience looking over many, many companies and will hopefully be able to give us quite a few insights on what makes them thrive or really stand out. So Toby, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be on it.
And let's jump straight in. Tell us a bit about your career then. Where did you start and how did you get into investment and especially within technology companies?
Yeah, sure. So I guess for someone who's ended up in technology, my progression has been a little bit different. I studied history at university, which was a subject I really enjoyed and loved. And so I decided to pursue it at university. But while I was at university, I started working at and interning at a number of different software companies and other startups in other spaces, and realized that I love technology and at some point wanted to work in some way related to technology. Obviously, history is not the most traditional background for doing that. So what I decided to do was that out of university, I needed to do something to get some sort of skill set that would make me valuable when kind of looking at or working with technology businesses. So what I did was I decided to intern at EY in the transactions team. So I did that as a summer internship and was lucky enough to get a full-time job, which I did in London in the transactions team, working mostly on technology, media, telco companies. So kind of very related to technology. And so I did that for 3.5 years, qualified as an accountant there, really picked up some useful skills that are very, very valuable in my day-to-day job, and then decided to make the move to venture capital. I started out thinking, not really knowing where I wanted to work within venture capital. There's so many different stages, so many different focuses. And so, I just went and tried to find a firm that had a culture that I thought would be really interesting and good to work in. And so I interned at the fund that I currently work at, Ox. Started off as a 6-month internship, obviously a bit of a leap, leaving a full-time job at EY to take an internship, but really worth it. And I think the thing is that I found was there was so much that you can understand from being inside the industry, even a little bit, that you don't have a good sense of from the outside. And I think it's one of the things that makes it very important to talk to people about VC if you're looking to get into VC before you do it, because you'll learn so much that you can't read about just by talking to people. So I did my 6-month internship and I've been at Ox now for over 3 years and loving my time here. It's working in VC is super interesting. The day-to-day is pretty unlike any other job. You have far more autonomy than any other job I've come across. Whether it's going and finding interesting companies to talk to, whether it's doing research on new trends, new kind of themes that you can get excited about, or whether it's actually working with companies to help them grow. There's so many different aspects of my job and I find it super interesting.
Yeah, well, and that's so evident to see from literally how you've explained it, and obviously we've had a chance to meet and speak a few times, and the getting an insight into people who can actually genuinely want to support companies and be there to help their journey, and especially with Ox, knowing Ox and now yourself, that's there's a real value there, isn't it? When you've got that breadth of experience over what makes a good company grow and thrive, and being able to pass that on to future investments and supporting them in their journey. Thinking then about moving straight on to sort of the crux of what makes great companies, talk to me a little bit about what when you're looking at companies and spotting the ones that you think will make it. Is there any common trends? Is there anything that stands out for you when you're specifically looking at them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we invest at the kind of what we would call the scale up stage. So that's where businesses already have customers, they're already generating revenue. They're typically not profitable, although they can be. And they have, a bit of a sales and marketing strategy in place that's working at least somewhat consistently. And that they come to us when they're looking to kind of grow that, whether then they're looking to internationalize. But one of the biggest things I think looking at businesses in any stage is really understanding what they do and what value that provides to customers. And that's really the biggest, most important thing that will determine the longevity of a business. It's whether or not they can continue to serve customers. I've looked at some businesses with really amazing, groundbreaking technology, but there isn't really a commercial need for it. And so, although it's a really interesting thing to dive into, really interesting thing to learn about, the business doesn't necessarily have a long-term, commercial perspective, because right now there aren't people willing to buy that. Now, there's obviously a flip side of that, which is, you can go out and create a technology that wasn't there before and customers will come to it because it's so groundbreaking. And that's definitely the case. And, there are a lot of amazing businesses that have done that. But actually, in terms of if I'm looking for an investment case or actually somewhere that I would want to work, it would be making sure that I understand that the business can actually deliver to customers and kind of generate value in the long term. So I think the biggest thing is really understanding, what do they do for their customers? Is that going to be the case in 5 years' time? Perhaps they're providing a service that actually in 5 years won't be so relevant. Maybe it's whether, we're transitioning off fossil fuels. So maybe it's a service around how we optimize pricing for fossil fuels. Maybe that will be less important in 5 to 10 years. And so maybe you don't want to spend so much of your career in an area that's going to be less relevant going forwards. Another area might be kind of understanding, if there's a recession, for example, is this service still going to be important? Are people still going to be willing to pay for it? How high up the agenda of a company that's going to be buying this service or product, how high up the agenda is it in terms of this is something we have to keep? Does it make the money business? Does it save the money business? Those are things to think about when you're kind of examining different business opportunities.
Yeah, and this is a really, really good view on this. As it's a slightly different view of many of the technology leaders that we speak to who will focus more on the tech stack. You're absolutely right. You've got to understand, and even as a young person joining a business, the commercial viability of the company you're joining. Is it a business that has longevity? And that doesn't, someone young can be looking at that just as much as if you're going to be the next CEO of that company. It's a pretty fundamental viewpoint. So thank you for that. And you mentioned actually something that was quite interesting with the example of obviously a business that specializes in fossil fuels. Well, that may not be here won't be here in 5-10 years time. Do you think companies that have that sort of that ESG, that environmental, social angle, do you think is that a place that people, or you might recommend people to look at as a business that will have longevity into the foreseeable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of debates right now about ESG and kind of how we should think about it and how involved it should be in business decisions. And they kind of go to and from, various different specific aspects of ESG. But I think what's very clear is that ESG as a trend is here to stay and its importance is growing. So, provided, again, within the kind of ESG space, there are businesses that add real value and there are ones that kind of add kind of short-term value that's maybe a little bit less tangible. I think thinking about, again, the value that they provide to the customers is important here because, if it's a platform, a software platform that allows you to, see what your carbon emissions are, that's useful and helpful. But there are a lot of other platforms doing that. And you might want to say, okay, well, what's the next step? Maybe they can go a step further and make active recommendations on how you can reduce it. That's where you start seeing value add and where you start seeing differentiation. And that's where, a business in that space would be more important than, for example, one where they're just saying, this is what you're emitting as a business. This is what you're emitting and here's how you can reduce it. And here are some steps and maybe some services that you can provide on top of that to kind of help companies do that better. So I think it's definitely a huge trend, and it's one here to stay, and there are opportunities within there, but it's thinking about ones that really do add value to the end customer.
Yeah, and great that you reinforce that, because you are right. You can have the best will in the world and be the most environmentally sound business in the world, but if it doesn't add value, then it's it may get lost in the world of competition, I guess. And so, going on a slightly different angle then, and we've spoken about the commercial viability of a business. Do you, from an investor point of view, but which may translate to young people looking, do you look at much at sort of the cultures of the companies that you invest in, or how they run it internally? And is there anything that stands out in your eyes of what makes a well-run business versus one that may not thrive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the culture is one of the most important areas. Obviously, the commercial side is important, the technical and product side is important, but the commercial one is often make or break. And there are a lot of investment opportunities we look at where we say, actually, you know what, the metrics are good, the product seems sensible, the market's probably there, but actually the culture of the team means that we think that it's not going to be a high-performing team in the long term. And actually, unsurprisingly, a lot of the areas that we see that lead to lack of performance are lack of diversity in a team. They have groupthink and they all think in the same way. That's actually quite a big one, and we often pass on opportunities for that reason. So I think, seeing that there is a good level of diversity within the team is important. Seeing that they really think about their culture and be deliberate about it, because, sometimes you see startups that they've been building so fast that the culture has kind of developed accidentally. And sometimes that can be a good thing and it can have a really good culture. And sometimes actually it might not have the best culture. And so the best companies with the best culture we've seen are ones that set out at the beginning saying, this is the culture I want to build. And they've kind of thought about the company and how it's developed around that. And you can see that pretty clearly when you start talking to people within that company. If you're interviewing at one, you can ask them, what's the culture like, and how does progression work, and how do you think about it? And if they start saying, they don't really have structures in place for helping people to progress, that might be a flag that although they might have the right mentality about culture, they don't actually have anything in place that means it's enforced. And particularly as organizations get larger and larger, that becomes more and more difficult. And so you need to start putting some structure around that and having thinking around, how do people develop, can we support our people internally and make the most of them?
Yeah. And that's such a good bit of advice as well, being able to ask those questions at interview and not being afraid to ask about what is the culture of the company, what does progression look like, how is there structures in place, because it does fundamentally show people what they're joining, essentially. And again, as you said, at scale up, you would hope that they would start having those quite in place. Startups very different maybe, and then but for scale ups. So leading on to the last question of the podcast then, and this has flown by as always, what one or two bits of career advice can you give our young people if they're trying to get a foot in the door? Anything that stands out in your mind that can help them stand out?
Yeah, sure. I think the first bit of advice I give is a bit that I received from one of the partners at EY actually when I was interviewing there, even before I'd got the job, and it was do something every day that makes you feel uncomfortable. And a good example of this is VC, where I work, is a lot about talking to people, meeting new people, reaching out to people you've never spoken to before. And I would say, as a person, as an individual, I'm not that comfortable doing that, or I haven't been in the past. But I've forced myself to do that because it's an important part of my job, and it's reaped a ton of reward for doing that. And so that's one example. I mean, whether it's reaching out to someone in a space that you might be interested in working in on LinkedIn or kind of through email, completely cold, even if you don't know them, I think is something worth doing. Certain spaces like venture capital, for example, are very opaque, and it's very hard to understand how everything works under the hood. And if you have a half an hour coffee with someone, you can learn so much more than you might be able to reading as much as you can online, because there's just kind of facets that people don't tend to write down. So I think those two come together, kind of do as much research and work about a space that you're looking to get into as you can. And whether that's, whether you have friends or parents or friends of parents, that have some link to the space, reach out to lots of people, because someone will get back to you. It probably won't be all of them, but there are people who spend time and will be willing to take time to kind of speak to you about space, and do that. And I guess that kind of ties into do things that make you feel uncomfortable. I guess the other one, and actually back to the progression point we were talking about before, is kind of always have always think around, what your progression looks like. And it's never too early to say, okay, I'm starting my job at this level. What do I need to do to get to the next level? Do I want to get to that next level, or maybe I want to move into something else? And always have at least one eye to the future, and kind of, it's never too early to say, what does a promotion look like for me, even if you're just starting out in a job, because it's helpful to know what you should be shooting for, and you can accelerate your career by doing that.
Yeah, and that is two really good bits of advice. And that's the first time I've heard about always do something uncomfortable, and I couldn't agree with it more. And as you said, whether that's trying to have the courage to start new conversations if that's not your natural go-to, or stretching yourself on a new technology or a new on something that you're not going to be an expert at from day one. It's so yeah, that's brilliant. So thank you for that. Well, Toby, the time has flown by. It's another podcast done. So, Toby, a massive thank you from me for your time on the show. I hope you found it okay.
Yeah, it's great, and thank you very much for having me.
And to all of our listeners, that is another episode of our Future Tech podcast. As many of you will know, the podcast is on our webpage, arrowsgroup.com/podcast, and it's shared via the STEM Ambassadors Association network, and on Spotify and other various channels. So for everyone listening, thank you. Toby, thank you. And this is another episode of Future Tech.